Eastern Dakota Territory, January 12, 1888. Mid-afternoon felt safe enough for children to attend school and men to work their barns. Then the front hit without warning. Wind and powdered snow erased the world in minutes. A barn 50 yards away became invisible. Neighbors who had mocked one homesteader all summer for digging what they called a useless tunnel were about to learn why he ignored their laughter. While they had built quick-frame barns and trusted speed over preparation, he had spent 10 weeks that summer excavating a roofed passage from his kitchen cellar straight to his barn. They called him a mole. They called it wasted labor. A real man walks to his barn, they said. He doesn't burrow like an animal. But when temperatures plunged to 40 below and winds made it feel like 60 below zero, those same neighbors couldn't find their own gates in the whiteout. Livestock across the plains began dying, not from cold alone, but from abandonment when farmers couldn't reach them through the blinding storm. 235 people would perish in what became known as the Children's Blizzard. Yet while his neighbors fought desperately to save what they could reach, this homesteader simply opened his cellar door and walked to his barn in shirtsleeves through calm, protected air. His herd survived 3 days of whiteout conditions because he had solved the problem everyone else thought was about courage instead of engineering. What did he understand about wind, visibility, and plain survival that made his neighbor's mockery turn to desperate questions for advice? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The morning of January 12, 1888, began like any winter day on the Dakota prairie. Thomas Anderson stepped outside his sod house at dawn to check the sky, clear enough, with only a light wind from the northwest. The thermometer nailed to his kitchen door read 18 above zero, cold but manageable for the work ahead. His neighbors would be doing their morning chores soon, the familiar routine of walking 50 to 150 feet from house to barn that defined Plains homestead life. For most settlers, that short distance represented nothing more than a brisk walk across open ground. For Thomas, it had become the foundation of an engineering problem he'd spent the previous summer solving. The Anderson claim sat on typical quarter-section land, 160 acres of rolling prairie with the house positioned to catch southern sun and the barn placed downhill for drainage, roughly 50 yards northeast of the kitchen door. His Norwegian father had taught him that winter killed in two ways: through cold that stopped the body's heat, and through wind that stripped away warmth faster than it could be replaced. But here on the Dakota frontier, Thomas had learned a third killer, the sudden whiteout that turned familiar ground into a navigation trap, where men died within shouting distance of their own doors. He had watched it happen during his second winter on the claim. Ole Peterson, a German-Russian settler 3 miles south, had stepped outside during a March blizzard to check on his milk cow. The barn stood 40 feet from his door, close enough that Peterson could see it clearly when the snow started. But prairie snow didn't fall like mountain snow. It blew horizontal, powered by wind that had gathered speed across hundreds of miles of flat ground. Peterson had made it to the barn, but when he tried to return, the wind had shifted the snow patterns enough that he couldn't find the house. His wife found him the next morning, frozen 15 feet from their front step, turned around completely in ground he'd walked daily for 3 years. That spring, while his neighbors focused on planting and fence repair, Thomas had begun sketching plans for what the local men called his Fool's Project. The idea was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Instead of fighting the wind and snow, eliminate them entirely by moving below ground level. A passage from the house cellar to the barn would create a protected corridor that remained navigable regardless of surface conditions. The neighbors who gathered at Grimstad's store to discuss farming matters had listened to his explanation with the patient tolerance reserved for harmless eccentrics. "A man walks upright," Harold Grimstad had said, speaking for the general consensus. "He doesn't crawl through the dirt like a prairie dog." The others had nodded agreement. Speed and courage were the accepted virtues of plain survival, not elaborate preparation for conditions that might never occur. Most homesteaders built quickly and built light, trusting their ability to endure short exposures to extreme weather rather than investing time in systems designed for worst-case scenarios. But Thomas had experienced worst-case scenarios. During his childhood in the Hardanger region of Norway, his grandfather had shown him farmsteads where families had tunneled between buildings to maintain access during the long mountain winters. The principle was sound. Air protected from wind remained calm and navigable even when surface conditions became lethal. The challenge was adapting Norwegian mountain techniques to Dakota prairie soil and homestead distances. By late May of 1887, Thomas had begun the excavation. The passage would run in a straight line from the northeast corner of his root cellar to the feed alley of his barn, a distance of 152 feet that he measured and remeasured with surveyor's precision. The trench needed to be deep enough to clear drifting snow, but not so deep as to require extensive timbering against cave-ins. After studying the drainage patterns around his buildings during spring runoff, he settled on a depth of 5.5 feet, enough clearance for a man to walk upright with only slight stooping, but shallow enough to excavate with basic farming tools. The work proceeded in sections during the early morning hours before field work began. Thomas would dig 6 to 8 feet of trench each day, removing roughly 2 tons of prairie soil that he carefully piled to form windbreaks and drainage berms around his barn foundation. The excavated earth wasn't waste. It became part of the overall weather protection system, redirecting wind patterns and creating dead air spaces that would prove valuable when winter storms arrived. The structural requirements were straightforward frontier carpentry, but applied to an unconventional purpose. Every 4 feet along the trench, Thomas installed vertical support posts cut from cottonwood logs, 8-inch diameter timber sunk 2 feet into undisturbed soil and extending 18 inches above the trench floor. Between these posts, he fitted horizontal planking to prevent soil cave-ins, using lumber salvaged from shipping crates and supplemented with new boards purchased from the railroad depot in Brookings. The roofing system required more careful engineering. Thomas laid 2-inch planks across the trench at 16-inch intervals, creating a deck strong enough to support the weight of packed earth above. Over this planking, he spread a layer of tar paper, expensive but necessary to prevent water infiltration that would turn the passage into an ice-lined death trap during freeze-thaw cycles. Finally, he covered the entire length with 12 to 18 inches of prairie sod, cut in uniform blocks and fitted together to create a living roof that would shed water while providing insulation. Drainage represented the most critical element of the design. Thomas pitched the passage floor at 1 inch per 8 feet of length, sloping downward from the house toward a collection sump near the barn end. This seemingly minor detail would prevent snowmelt and groundwater from accumulating in the passage, where it would freeze into treacherous ice that could make the tunnel unusable precisely when it was needed most. By September, the passage was complete but untested. His neighbors had watched the construction with bemused interest, stopping by occasionally to examine his progress and shake their heads at the summer's worth of labor invested in what they considered an elaborate solution to an imaginary problem. The tunnel represented a different philosophy of frontier survival, one that prioritized systematic preparation over individual endurance. Now, on the morning that would test every assumption about Plains homesteading, Thomas checked his weather instruments one final time and headed inside for breakfast. The barometer had dropped 2 points overnight, and the northwestern sky showed the faint haze that sometimes preceded major storms. But like his neighbors, he had no way of knowing that this particular storm would rewrite the rules of prairie survival and turn his summer of wasted labor into the difference between life and death for both man and beast. The construction had begun in earnest during the 3rd week of May, 1887, when the spring planting was finished and Thomas could dedicate his early morning hours to excavation. He had calculated that digging the passage by hand would require approximately 60 days of steady work, assuming he could move 4 cubic yards of prairie soil each morning before the day's farming began. The mathematics were straightforward but demanding: 152 feet of trench, 3 feet wide and 5.5 feet deep, totaling roughly 300 cubic yards of earth that would need to be moved one shovelful at a time. Thomas approached the excavation with the methodical precision his father had taught him for any major construction project. Each morning at dawn, he would pace out the day's section using a surveyor's chain borrowed from the county office, marking the trench boundaries with wooden stakes driven exactly 18 inches apart. The straightness of the passage was critical. Any deviation would create blind spots where drifting snow could accumulate or where a man might lose his bearings in absolute darkness. Using a mason's level and a long straight edge cut from seasoned oak, he maintained a perfectly linear route that varied less than 6 inches from true over its entire length. The prairie soil presented unique challenges that differed significantly from the mountain ground Thomas remembered from Norway. The top 18 inches consisted of densely matted grass roots and black earth that had never been broken by plow or spade. Below this layer lay Dakota clay, dense plastic soil that became nearly impermeable when wet but cracked and shifted during dry periods. Thomas learned to time his digging according to soil moisture, working in the clay when it was slightly damp and pliable, but avoiding excavation during wet periods when the walls would slump and require constant reshaping. The spoiled dirt became an integral component of the weather protection system rather than simply waste material to be hauled away. Thomas used the excavated soil to build strategic berms around his barn foundation, creating wind shadows and dead air spaces that would reduce the velocity of storm winds hitting the building. The berms rose 3 feet above ground level and extended 12 feet out from the barn walls, angled at 30-degree slopes that would shed snow rather than accumulating drifts. Additional soil went into raising the grade around his house foundation, improving drainage while creating a subtle hillock that would help deflect wind patterns during severe weather. The wall support system required careful attention to both immediate safety and long-term stability. Thomas cut his vertical posts from cottonwood trees harvested along the James River, selecting straight-grained logs with minimal taper and no visible defects. Each post measured 8 inches in diameter and 12 feet in length, providing sufficient material to sink 2 feet below the trench floor while extending 18 inches above the finished grade. The posts were positioned every 4 feet along both walls, creating a grid of structural supports that could resist the lateral pressure of prairie clay during wet seasons and frost expansion during winter freeze cycles. Between the vertical posts, Thomas installed horizontal retaining planks cut from pine lumber purchased at the railroad depot. The planking system used 1-inch boards placed horizontally with 6-inch vertical spacing, creating a ladder-like pattern that distributed soil pressure evenly while allowing for minor settling without structural failure. Each board was cut to exactly 42 inches in length, spanning the distance between posts with 2 inches of overlap at each end for nailing. The planks were secured with hand-forged iron nails, driven at slight downward angles to resist withdrawal under load. The roofing structure represented the most technically demanding aspect of the construction, requiring Thomas to adapt traditional Norwegian timber framing techniques to the available materials and soil conditions of the Dakota prairie. He began by installing primary roof beams cut from seasoned oak, 2x8 timbers positioned every 16 inches along the entire length of the passage. These beams spanned the 3-foot width of the trench with 6 inches of bearing surface on each wall, distributing the weight of the earth cover across the vertical support posts rather than relying on the soil walls alone. Over the primary beams, Thomas laid roof planking using 1-inch pine boards cut to 4-foot length and fitted edge to edge with no gaps. The planking created a solid deck capable of supporting the weight of a man walking above ground while providing a stable base for the waterproof layer that would follow. Each plank was secured with 3 nails per beam contact, driven flush with the wood surface to prevent puncturing the tar paper that would be installed above. The waterproofing system used materials that were expensive by frontier standards but essential for preventing the catastrophic failure that would occur if water infiltrated the passage and froze during winter conditions. Thomas purchased 12 rolls of tar paper from a building supply dealer in Brookings, paying nearly $15 for material that represented 2 weeks' worth of farm labor wages. The tar paper was laid in overlapping sheets with 6-inch margins at all seams, creating a continuous moisture barrier that extended from wall to wall across the entire roof surface. The seams were sealed using pine tar heated in a cast iron pot and applied with a brush while still liquid, forming waterproof joints that would remain flexible during temperature changes. The final earth cover consisted of prairie sod cut in uniform blocks measuring 12 inches by 18 inches and approximately 4 inches thick. Thomas cut the sod blocks using a specialized spade with a sharp, straight blade, working in areas where the grass was thick enough to hold the soil together, but not so dense as to create excessive weight on the roof structure. The sod blocks were fitted together like puzzle pieces, with the grass side facing upward to maintain living roots that would continue growing and binding the soil into a cohesive, water-shedding surface. Drainage considerations required Thomas to engineer a system that would handle both surface runoff and any moisture that might penetrate the waterproof layer despite his precautions. He pitched the passage floor at a consistent grade of 1 inch per 8 feet, sloping from the house end toward the barn, where he excavated a collection sump lined with fieldstone. The sump measured 3 feet square and 2 feet deep, providing sufficient capacity to collect snowmelt and groundwater that could then be removed manually if necessary during periods of heavy moisture infiltration. Ventilation presented the final technical challenge, providing enough air circulation to prevent the accumulation of stale air and dangerous gases while avoiding openings large enough to admit snow during blizzard conditions. Thomas installed 2 ventilation pipes cut from 6-inch diameter stovepipe, positioning one near each end of the passage and extending them 18 inches above the finished ground level. The pipes were capped with simple hinged covers that could be opened during calm weather and closed during storms, allowing controlled air exchange without compromising the weather protection that was the passage's primary purpose. By late August, neighbors began stopping by with increasing frequency to examine the progress of what they had begun calling the mole tunnel. Harold Grimstad brought his teenage son to see the construction, shaking his head at the elaborate engineering Thomas had invested in what remained, in Grimstad's opinion, an unnecessarily complicated solution to a simple problem. "Winter comes every year," Grimstad observed, running his hand along the smooth planking of the roof structure. "A man learns to move fast and get his work done. He doesn't build himself an underground road." The comment drew approving nods from the other men who had gathered to inspect Thomas's handiwork, but Thomas noticed that several of them were taking careful note of his construction methods, measuring distances and examining joints with the attention of men who were filing away information for possible future use. The weather prediction system that served Dakota Territory in 1888 consisted of a handful of military signal stations connected by telegraph lines that frequently failed during the very storms they were meant to forecast. The nearest station to Thomas Anderson's, Homestead operated from Fort Sisseton, 60 miles northeast, where a lone sergeant took daily readings from instruments that provided accurate local conditions, but limited insight into the massive weather systems moving across the continental interior. On the morning of January 11th, the Fort Sisseton station reported clear skies and moderate temperatures, with no indication of the Arctic front that was already sweeping south from Canada at unprecedented speed. The storm that would become known as the Children's Blizzard represented a meteorological phenomenon that occurred perhaps once in a generation, a collision between warm, moist air moving north from the Gulf of Mexico and an Arctic air mass plunging south from the Canadian prairie with unusual velocity and intensity. The temperature differential between these air masses exceeded 70 degrees, creating atmospheric conditions that generated winds approaching hurricane force and precipitation that fell as fine powdered snow capable of penetrating the smallest gaps in clothing or shelter. More critically, the storm moved faster than the communication systems of the era could track, arriving at individual homesteads hours before any warning could reach the scattered farming communities. Thomas had developed his own weather prediction methods based on atmospheric pressure readings and sky conditions, using a barometer purchased from a scientific instrument dealer in Chicago and supplemented by observation techniques learned from his Norwegian grandfather. On the evening of January 11th, his barometer showed a pressure drop of 4 points in 6 hours, a rate of change that indicated major atmospheric disturbance approaching from the northwest. The western horizon displayed the peculiar greenish tint that often preceded severe winter storms, and the wind patterns had shifted from the prevailing southwesterly flow to intermittent gusts from due north, suggesting that Arctic air was beginning to displace the warmer surface layer. These signs meant little to most plain settlers, who relied on immediate visual cues rather than instrumental measurements or systematic weather observation. The morning of January 12th appeared deceptively calm across much of Dakota Territory, with moderate temperatures and light winds that encouraged normal outdoor activities. Children walked to school carrying light coats suitable for the existing conditions, while farmers planned routine maintenance tasks that required extended periods outside their buildings. The psychological effect of the pleasant morning conditions created a false sense of security that would prove fatal when circumstances changed with unprecedented speed. At 11:30 in the morning, the temperature at Thomas's homestead stood at 26 degrees above zero, warm enough that he had removed his heavy coat while repairing a gate hinge in his barn lot. The wind remained light and variable, shifting between southwest and northwest quadrants without the sustained direction that usually preceded major storms. Visibility extended to the horizon in all directions, allowing him to see the smoke from neighboring homesteads several miles away and to observe the normal patterns of winter activity across the township. The change began as a subtle darkening of the northwestern sky, initially appearing as nothing more than distant clouds that might bring light snow by evening. Thomas noted the development in his weather journal, recording the time as 11:45 and describing the cloud formation as dense but not immediately threatening. Within 15 minutes, however, the distant clouds had developed into a wall of darkness that extended across the entire northern horizon, moving south with visible speed that indicated wind velocities far beyond normal storm patterns. The temperature drop began at approximately 12:15, falling from 26 degrees to 18 degrees in less than 10 minutes as the leading edge of the Arctic air mass displaced the surface warmth that had characterized the morning. Thomas felt the change as a sudden shift in the quality of the air around him. The mild breeze that had been stirring the loose snow at his feet was replaced by intermittent gusts of wind that carried the sharp metallic taste of extreme cold. The barometer inside his house registered a pressure drop so rapid that the needle appeared to be falling continuously rather than settling at discrete measurement points. By 12:30, the wind had intensified to sustained speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, driving before it the first particles of snow that marked the arrival of the storm's precipitation shield. This was not the heavy, wet snow of typical prairie storms, but rather a fine, crystalline powder that remained suspended in the wind stream and penetrated clothing, buildings, and equipment with the persistence of driven sand. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees above zero, representing a decline of 18 degrees in 15 minutes, and indicating that the full Arctic air mass had not yet arrived. The visibility began deteriorating at 12:45 as the wind-driven snow created an increasingly dense curtain between Thomas and his reference points across the landscape. The neighbor's house, clearly visible 30 minutes earlier at a distance of half a mile, disappeared behind the moving wall of white particles. His own barn, standing 50 yards from where he worked near the house, became intermittently invisible as gusts of wind created temporary whiteout conditions that lasted several seconds before clearing enough to reveal familiar landmarks. Thomas retreated to his house as the conditions continued deteriorating, but not before noting that the storm possessed characteristics he had never experienced during his 6 years on the Dakota frontier. The wind did not howl or roar as it did during typical blizzards, but rather produced a continuous hissing sound as millions of ice particles collided with every surface exposed to the moving air. The snow did not fall vertically or even at the steep angles common during heavy storms, but moved horizontally with such velocity that it struck exposed skin with sufficient force to cause immediate pain and numbness. Inside his house, Thomas consulted the barometer and found that the pressure had dropped to 28.6 inches of mercury, the lowest reading he had recorded since installing the instrument 3 years earlier. The temperature outside his kitchen door now registered -2 degrees, representing a total decline of 28 degrees in less than 2 hours. Most significantly, the wind speed had increased to what he estimated as 40 to 50 miles per hour based on its effect on the snow patterns visible through his window, creating conditions that would make any outdoor travel extremely hazardous regardless of the distance involved. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Thomas made his final outdoor observation before the storm reached full intensity. Stepping onto his front porch, he found that he could no longer see his barn, despite knowing its exact location and despite the fact that no obstacles blocked his line of sight. The wind-driven snow had created a continuous wall of white particles that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet in any direction. More critically, the wind velocity had reached levels that made it difficult to maintain balance while standing in a protected position behind his house wall. indicating that movement across open ground would be virtually impossible for anyone not equipped with specialized cold weather gear and navigation aids. The storm had arrived with a speed and intensity that rendered useless all the standard methods plain settlers used to maintain their daily routines during winter weather. Rope guidelines, compass bearings, and familiarity with local landmarks became meaningless when visibility dropped to zero and wind speeds reached levels that could knock a man down or strip away his body heat within minutes of exposure. For the first time since beginning his homestead, Thomas faced weather conditions that could make the 50-yard distance to his barn as dangerous as a journey across unmarked prairie. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the storm had reached full intensity across the Dakota prairie, creating conditions that transformed familiar homestead layouts into potentially fatal navigation puzzles. Thomas watched from his kitchen window as the last visible reference points disappeared behind walls of wind-driven snow that moved with such velocity that individual particles struck the glass with audible impacts. The temperature had dropped to -12 degrees, but the wind chill created by sustained gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour produced conditions equivalent to 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to cause frostbite within minutes and death within an hour for anyone caught without adequate shelter. Harold Grimstad, 3/4 of a mile southwest of the Anderson homestead, had been splitting firewood behind his barn when the temperature began its precipitous decline. Following standard frontier practice, he had continued working until the wind made it difficult to control his axe, then gathered an armload of split wood and started toward his house. The distance from his woodpile to his kitchen door measured 62 feet, a walk he had made hundreds of times during his 4 years on the claim. But as he stepped away from the shelter of the barn wall, the wind-driven snow struck him with such force that he instinctively turned his back to the storm and lost his bearings completely. Grimstad's experience illustrated the precise mechanism by which the children's blizzard killed people within sight of their own homes. The storm produced what meteorologists would later classify as ground blizzard conditions, horizontal snow movement at ground level that eliminated all visual reference points while maintaining clear skies above the wind-driven precipitation layer. A man could look up and see patches of blue sky while being unable to see his own feet due to the dense curtain of snow particles moving at hurricane velocity just above ground level. Grimstad dropped his armload of wood and attempted to retrace his path to the barn, but the wind had already obliterated his footprints, and the snow had begun accumulating around the barn walls in patterns that changed the building's apparent shape and size. After 20 minutes of searching for either his house or his barn, Grimstad realized that he was experiencing the navigation failure that had killed old Peterson the previous winter. The wind chill had already begun affecting his judgment and motor control. His hands were numb despite heavy mittens, and his legs felt increasingly unsteady as the cold penetrated his wool clothing. Following survival techniques learned during military service in Minnesota, he began moving in a systematic search pattern, walking 20 paces in one direction, then turning 90 degrees and walking 20 paces perpendicular to his original course. This grid search method was designed to prevent the circular wandering that often characterized hypothermia victims, but it required more time than his body heat could sustain in the existing conditions. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun his first test of the passage system he had spent the summer constructing. At 2 o'clock, with the storm showing no signs of diminishing, he descended into his root cellar and opened the wooden door that marked the beginning of the underground route to his barn. The contrast between surface conditions and the environment inside the passage was immediately apparent. The air was still and quiet, with no wind noise and no sensation of moving particles. The temperature inside the tunnel registered 34 degrees, exactly 46 degrees, warmer than the surface air temperature and completely isolated from the wind chill that made outdoor exposure potentially fatal. Thomas lit a kerosene lantern and began walking the 152-foot length of his tunnel, inspecting the construction for any signs of structural failure or moisture infiltration that might compromise the passage during extended use. The wooden support posts showed no evidence of movement or settling, and the roof planking remained tight and secure despite the weight of 18 inches of sod covering and the additional load of accumulating snow above ground. Most critically, the drainage system was functioning as designed. The floor remained dry and clear, despite the moisture that inevitably accompanied any major storm system. The barn and entrance opened into the feed alley exactly as planned, allowing Thomas to emerge directly into the area where his livestock was sheltered without exposure to external conditions. His herd consisted of 43 head of mixed cattle, milk cows, beef steers, and breeding stock that represented the primary economic foundation of his homestead operation. Under normal winter conditions, the animals could survive several days without attention if provided with adequate feed and water before a storm arrived. But the children's blizzard was creating abnormal conditions that threatened livestock survival through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. The extreme wind penetrated the barn walls through gaps that remained unnoticeable during ordinary weather, creating drafts that increased the animals' metabolic demand for heat energy while making it difficult for them to maintain normal body temperature. The cattle clustered together in the most sheltered corner of the barn, but their breathing had begun creating moisture problems as water vapor condensed on the cold interior walls and froze into ice accumulations that further reduced the building's insulation value. Most critically, the automatic watering system had frozen solid, cutting off the animals' access to the liquid water they required to process dry feed and maintain normal digestive function. Thomas began the methodical process of maintaining his herd through conditions that were destroying livestock operations across the region. Using a steel pry bar heated in the forge corner of his barn, he broke through the ice that had sealed his water trough and began the labor-intensive process of providing liquid water by hauling heated buckets from his house. The passage allowed him to make multiple trips between his kitchen stove and the barn without exposure to conditions that would have made such repeated journeys impossible using conventional above-ground routes. The feeding process required equal attention to detail and systematic approach. Thomas distributed hay in measured portions designed to provide maximum heat energy without overloading the animal's digestive systems during stress conditions. Each cow received approximately 25 pounds of hay per day, nearly double the normal winter ration, but divided into smaller portions distributed throughout the day rather than provided in single large feedings. This feeding strategy helped the cattle generate internal heat through digestion while avoiding the digestive problems that could occur when stressed animals consumed large quantities of dry feed without adequate water intake. By evening of the first day, Thomas had established a routine that allowed him to maintain normal care for his livestock despite surface conditions that had made similar care impossible for his neighbors. Every 2 hours, he would descend into his passage, walk to the barn, check water supplies, distribute feed, and monitor the animals for signs of cold stress or respiratory problems caused by the moisture-laden air inside the barn. Each trip required approximately 40 minutes of work time, but the travel component, which would have represented the most dangerous aspect of the process under normal circumstances, was eliminated entirely by the protected passage. The contrast with neighboring operations was becoming apparent even before the storm reached its peak intensity. Grimstad had eventually found his way back to his house after nearly an hour of searching, but had been unable to reach his barn since the morning feeding. His 12 head of cattle were confined to the barn with a single day's supply of hay and no access to liquid water after their automatic system froze during the early hours of the storm. The Miller family, 1 mile east of Thomas, faced similar conditions with a larger herd of 60 head that represented their entire investment in the homestead operation. As the first night of the storm settled over the Dakota prairie, the temperature continued dropping toward the -40 readings that would be recorded at official weather stations across the region. The wind maintained its intensity, creating conditions that would persist for 3 full days and test every aspect of frontier survival planning. Thomas completed his evening barn check at 9 o'clock, walking through calm air in his underground passage while above ground. His neighbors huddled in their houses knowing that their livestock was beyond reach until the storm ended. The engineering solution that had been mocked as excessive preparation was proving to be the difference between operational continuity and potential economic disaster. The morning of January 15th brought the first break in the storm that had paralyzed Dakota Territory for 3 days, but the damage assessment revealed the full scope of what would become one of the most devastating weather events in Plains history. The official death toll would eventually reach 235 people, with livestock losses numbering in the tens of thousands as ranchers and farmers discovered the frozen remains of cattle that had died within yards of shelter they could not reach. Harold Grimstad emerged from his house to find that his barn door had drifted shut under 4 feet of packed snow, and when he finally dug through to his livestock, 8 of his 12 head had perished from dehydration and cold stress. The Miller family faced total catastrophe. Their 60 head of cattle, representing 4 years of careful breeding and selection, had been trapped in a barn with inadequate ventilation and no access to liquid water after their well pump froze solid on the first day of the storm. When the family was finally able to reach the building, they discovered that 43 animals had died, some from cold, others from dehydration, and several from carbon dioxide poisoning caused by inadequate air circulation in the sealed building. The financial loss exceeded $800, more than twice the value of their homestead claim, and effectively ending their attempt at establishing a successful farming operation. Thomas Anderson's experience stood in stark contrast to the devastation that surrounded him. Throughout the 3-day duration of the storm, he had maintained his normal livestock care routine with only minor modifications required by the extreme conditions. His passage had remained fully functional, allowing him to make scheduled trips to the barn every 2 hours during daylight and twice during each night to monitor water supplies and distribute feed. The underground route had proven completely immune to the surface conditions that made conventional barn access impossible, maintaining consistent temperature and eliminating the wind exposure that represented the primary threat to human survival. The survival of Thomas's herd demonstrated the practical value of systematic preparation over individual endurance when facing extreme weather conditions. While his neighbors had relied on speed and courage to maintain their operations during typical winter storms, the children's blizzard had created conditions that rendered these traditional approaches not merely inadequate but actively dangerous. The 43 head of cattle in Thomas's barn had received consistent care throughout the crisis, with regular feeding, adequate water supplies, and monitoring for respiratory problems caused by the high humidity that developed inside sealed buildings during extended storms. More significantly, Thomas had been able to provide assistance to neighbors whose own survival was threatened by the storm's intensity and duration. On the afternoon of January 14th, when the wind had temporarily decreased to manageable levels, Harold Grimstad had appeared at Thomas's kitchen door in a state approaching hypothermia. Grimstad had attempted to reach his barn that morning and had become disoriented in the continuing whiteout conditions, spending nearly 2 hours searching for familiar landmarks before finally locating the Anderson homestead by following a fence line that led to the correct section. Thomas had provided immediate medical attention for Grimstad's frostbitten hands and feet, but more importantly, he had been able to use his passage system to check on Grimstad's livestock and provide emergency care that prevented additional losses. Using the underground route to reach his own barn, Thomas had gathered supplies and equipment needed for cold weather livestock management, then had accompanied Grimstad on a dangerous but successful attempt to reach the neighboring barn through above-ground travel during a brief lull in the storm intensity. The rescue operation had required careful timing and systematic safety procedures that reflected Thomas's engineering approach to frontier survival. Both men had equipped themselves with 30 feet of rope that connected them at the waist, ensuring that neither could become separated and lost during the traverse across open ground. They had carried emergency shelter materials, canvas tarps, and wooden stakes that could be deployed quickly if conditions deteriorated while they were away from buildings. Most critically, they had established a maximum time limit of 1 hour for the entire operation, with an absolute commitment to return to Thomas's house regardless of the status of their mission if weather conditions showed any signs of worsening. The condition of Grimstad's remaining cattle illustrated the precise mechanisms by which the storm had killed livestock across the region. The 4 surviving animals showed severe signs of dehydration despite having access to snow, which cattle cannot consume in sufficient quantities to meet their water requirements during cold stress conditions. Their feed consumption had dropped dramatically as their digestive systems became impaired by the lack of liquid water needed to process dry hay and grain. Most seriously, their respiratory systems had been compromised by breathing air with extremely high moisture content inside the sealed barn, creating conditions that would have led to pneumonia and additional deaths if the storm had continued for additional days. Thomas and Grimstad had worked systematically to address each of these problems using techniques that required access to heated water and specialized equipment stored in Thomas's barn. They had heated water using a portable forge and had provided the dehydrated animals with small quantities of warm liquid at regular intervals, avoiding the digestive shock that could occur when severely dehydrated cattle consumed large quantities of water rapidly. They had improved barn ventilation by creating small openings that allowed air circulation without admitting dangerous quantities of wind and snow, and they had redistributed the available feed to provide maximum nutrition while accommodating the animals' reduced digestive capacity. The success of these emergency measures demonstrated the broader principle that had guided Thomas's construction of the passage system. Individual heroism and emergency response could address immediate crises, but systematic preparation eliminated the need for heroic measures by maintaining operational continuity even during extreme conditions. The passage had allowed Thomas to provide normal care for his own livestock, while simultaneously making possible the emergency assistance that had saved most of Grimstad's remaining animals. Word of Thomas's success spread quickly through the scattered homestead community, as neighbors began assessing their losses and sharing accounts of their experiences during the storm. The tunnel that had been dismissed as the eccentric project of an overcautious immigrant was now being discussed as a practical solution to a problem that had proven far more serious than anyone had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of the storm's end, 3 other homesteaders in the township had begun planning similar passage systems for construction during the coming summer. The practical details of tunnel construction became the subject of intense discussion at Grimstad's store and at the monthly township meetings where farmers gathered to discuss shared concerns and coordinate community projects. Thomas found himself explaining the drainage requirements, support spacing, and waterproofing techniques that had made his passage functional during the extreme conditions that had tested every aspect of its design. The measurements and material specifications that had seemed excessive during the planning phase were now recognized as conservative engineering that had provided an adequate safety margin when faced with weather conditions beyond the normal range of prairie experience. The broader lesson extended beyond livestock management to fundamental questions about frontier survival strategies and community preparedness for extreme weather events. The children's blizzard had demonstrated that the traditional plains approach of relying on individual endurance and rapid movement between buildings was inadequate when faced with conditions that eliminated visibility and made exposure potentially fatal within minutes. The engineering approach that Thomas had applied to a specific problem, maintaining barn access during severe weather, represented a philosophy of systematic preparation that could be applied to other aspects of homestead operations where conventional methods might prove inadequate during crisis conditions. As spring approached and the immediate crisis of winter survival gave way to planning for the coming year, the community had begun incorporating the lessons learned during 3 days when normal routines became impossible and familiar distances became potentially fatal journeys. The man who had been called a mole for his summer of underground construction was now recognized as someone who had understood principles of weather, engineering, and survival that others were only beginning to appreciate.